By the middle of the 1970s, something strange was happening on Britain's motorways. The lorries thundering up the M1 and the M6 were starting to wear foreign badges. Volvo, Scania, DF, Mercedes-Benz. They were quieter, faster, and more comfortable than anything built on British soil. And the homegrown makers that had ruled these roads for decades were suddenly struggling to keep up. Famous old names began to wobble, then fall silent. But in a quiet Cheshire town called Sandbach, one small, stubborn company refused to roll over. Its answer was a plain, fibreglass-cabbed lorry called the ERF B Series. To understand why that truck mattered so much, you have to understand what it was up against. For most of the post-war years, British hauliers had been a loyal bunch. They bought British, AEC, Atkinson, Leyland, Foden, ERF. Solid, no-nonsense lorries that men called gaffers' wagons. Cheap to buy, cheap to run, and dependable enough to keep a small family firm in business. Most of them rumbled along behind a slow-revving Gardner diesel, an engine so frugal and so long-lived that drivers swore it would outlast the chassis it was bolted into. For years, that was enough. Britain's roads were slow, the loads were limited to 32 tons, and there was a rule that a truck only needed 6 horsepower for every ton it carried. Nobody was in much of a hurry, and the lorries reflected it. Then the motorways came. Suddenly a journey that once took 2 days could be done between breakfast and tea. Operators wanted to cover more miles in a shift. Drivers, who had spent their lives in cramped, draughty, deafening day cabs, wanted somewhere decent to sit and somewhere to sleep on a long night away from home. The old British formula, built for a slower world, started to look tired and out of date. The first crack appeared in 1967. A Northumbrian haulier took a chance on a Swedish lorry called the Volvo F86, brought into the country by a firm up in Scotland. It was the first foreign-built truck to sell here in any real number, and the drivers who climbed into it never wanted to go back. Word spread, first across Scotland and the north, then the length of the country. And then came the big one, the Volvo F88. If you ask anyone who was on the road in those days, the F88 is the truck that changed everything. It had a proper all-steel cab at a time when some British lorries were still being built with timber framing under the panels. It had power steering, a heater, a radio, a fully adjustable seat, and the option of a sleeper bunk behind the driver. Independent testers measured the noise inside the cab and found it closer to a saloon car than a lorry. And under the floor sat a compact turbocharged engine, less than 10 litres, yet pushing out close to 300 horsepower. Compare that with a typical British 32-tonner of the time, making do with 180 horsepower from its big naturally aspirated Gardner and a 6-speed box. The Volvo was faster, calmer, and a world away in comfort. Drivers gave it a nickname. They called it the King. It was not just about the motorway either. This was the great age of the overland runs, of British lorries crawling all the way out to Tehran, Kabul, and the Middle East. On those punishing trips, a comfortable cab and a strong, reliable engine were not luxuries, they were survival. Famous firms like Astron came to swear by Scania, partly for that reliability and partly because the Swedes had dealers and spare parts dotted right across the route. A British truck that broke down in the desert with no support nearby was a very expensive mistake. Scania pressed the attack with its 110 and 140 range. DAF came in with its 2000 series. Mercedes-Benz and Magirus Stewart's pushed through the door behind them. At the start of the decade, there were around 20 British truck makers. Across the Channel, there were more than 40, and it felt like most of them were heading straight for the British market, sniffing out every weakness in the home-built kit. The reason cut deep. These European trucks had been designed for the heavier weights allowed on the continent. They came ready with 250 horsepower and more, with comfortable sleeper cabs built in from the start. Britain, with its smaller 32-ton limit, had spent years building lighter, simpler machines for a smaller job. The foreign makers were not catching up to us. They had arrived a step ahead, and they knew it. Britain's biggest maker, Leyland, was in no state to fight back. Tangled up in the troubled British car industry after a disastrous merger, its profits were drained away to prop up loss-making car brands. Starved of investment, it poured what money it had into a doomed new engine, the 500 series, that cost it sale after sale. The giant of the British road was slow, painfully slow, to react. One by one, the proud old marks began to look like they were running out of road, and this is where the story turns to Sandbach. ERF was never a giant. It was founded back in 1933 by a man called Edwin Richard Foden, whose initials gave the company its name. He had walked out of Foden, the firm his own father had built, because he believed the future belonged to the diesel engine, and the Foden boardroom did not agree. So he set up on his own, just down the road, and built his first diesel lorry from bought-in parts. He gave that very first chassis the number 63, because 63 was his age at the time. That habit of buying in parts matters more than it sounds. From the very beginning, ERF did not try to make everything itself. It bought the best engines from Gardner, the best gearboxes from David Brown, the best axles from Kirkstall Forge, and later from Eaton, Rockwell and others, then assembled them into a chassis of its own design. The clever part was the choice it handed the customer. A haulier could specify almost exactly the driveline he wanted, mixing and matching to suit his work and his pocket. It was a small firm, run by engineers, turning out a few thousand trucks a year at most. In a market now being flooded with money and muscle from Sweden and Germany, ERF had no hope of winning a spending war, so it did not try to fight that way. It fought the way it always had, with proven engineering and plain common sense. There was one more piece of luck. In 1970, ERF had tried to buy its old rival Atkinson and lost out to another bidder. But when the deal went against the Atkinson workers, some of their best people chose to move across to ERF instead. One of them was a gifted engineer whose influence would shape the next great Sandbach cab. The pieces were quietly coming together. In 1974, at the big motor show, ERF pulled the covers off its answer. The B Series, on paper it looked almost ordinary. There was no exotic new engine, no clever turbocharged showpiece to dazzle the crowds. The B Series offered exactly the power units British hauliers already knew and trusted. The Gardner, slow and unburstable. The Cummins, strong and willing once it had been run in properly. The Rolls-Royce Eagle, with plenty of muscle for those who wanted it, in outputs up to around 280 horsepower. Behind them sat familiar Fuller, David Brown and ZF gearboxes that a driver could change without thinking twice. None of it was a gamble. Every single piece had already proven itself in years of hard service, which meant a haulier knew exactly what he was buying before he handed over a penny. But the B Series was not just the old recipe in a new wrapper. The cab was genuinely new and genuinely clever. It was known as the SP cab, standing for steel and plastics. A strong steel frame, clad in fibreglass panels that simply would not rust. The structure was built down in Northampton and then fitted out by ERF back in Sandbach. Anyone who had watched a steel cab slowly dissolve in the salt and rain of a British winter understood instantly why a rust-proof cab was worth having, and for the first time on a production ERF, the whole cab tilted forward, swinging right up, so a mechanic could get straight at the engine. Routine jobs could even be done through a hinged panel at the front. For a fitter in a cold, dark yard at 6 in the morning, that was a real gift. Inside, it was far better than its reputation suggests. There were warm brown and tan trims, a black vinyl dashboard, clear round Smith's gauges, and the tachograph sitting proudly in the centre where the driver could read it at a glance. You could have it as a plain day cab, or, soon enough, with a proper factory sleeper for the long-distance men. One famous sleeper conversion, built by an ERF-owned coach builder, was so neatly done that a motoring magazine of the day praised it for looking like part of the original design rather than a bolt-on afterthought. Drivers who had been told all British cabs were grim climbed into a B Series and found something solid, sensible and well laid out. In truth, some who drove both reckoned the ERF cab was a genuine match for the Volvo, and in one or two ways even better. It helped too that the B Series was never really just one truck, it was a whole family. There were nimble four-wheel tractor units for general haulage, rugged 8-wheel tippers for the quarries and the building sites, heavy rigids for the long-distance trunkers, and lighter versions for the smaller jobs around town. Whatever a British operator needed hauling, there was usually a B Series built to do it, badged with a code that told you its weight, its axles and its engine all at a glance. That breadth was part of the appeal. A firm could run a whole mixed fleet of ERFs, train its fitters on one familiar design, and keep a single shelf of spares for the lot. In a hard-nosed business where time was money, that kind of simplicity quietly paid for itself, so the lines were drawn. On one side stood the Europeans, selling comfort, power and polish. On the other stood the B Series, selling something quieter and harder to put in a glossy brochure. Trust. Here is what kept loyal operators coming back to ERF. A B Series was cheaper to buy than a Volvo or a Scania. When it broke, and every lorry breaks, the parts were common, the engines were familiar, and a good fitter could put it right in the firm's own workshop without waiting days on an expensive dealer. The Scottish long-distance men loved one combination in particular, a Gardner engine, a David Brown gearbox, and a Kirkstall rear axle, a driveline that, looked after properly, would run for well over 1 million miles before it ever needed serious attention. The fibreglass cab shrugged off the worst of the weather. The whole truck was built to be lived with, worked hard, and mended cheaply. For a haulier counting every penny at the end of the month, that was worth more than a soft seat and a fancy badge. For a good while, it worked. The B Series became the backbone of countless British fleets. It hauled steel and bricks and beer and machinery the length and breadth of the country, the everyday workhorse you would see in every yard and at every roadside cafe. A few of the braver operators even took them far beyond British shores, running ERFs out across North Africa and the Middle East on those legendary overland trips. The plain lorry from Sandbach had earned its place on the road, but trust alone could only hold the line for so long, and the cracks in the B Series story were as real as its strengths. The biggest problem sat right at the heart of the truck, the Gardner engine. For decades it had been the beating heart of British haulage, prized for its remarkable fuel economy and its near-religious reliability. A Gardner ran cool, ran clean, and ran almost forever. But the man behind it had set his face firmly against turbocharging and against change of any kind. While Volvo, Scania and Cummins were squeezing ever more power out of their engines, the Gardner stayed loyal to the old ways. It was beautifully efficient and gentle on fuel, but it was slow revving and, by the standards of the new arrivals, simply short on power. On a long motorway drag or a steep Pennine climb, a Gardner-engined ERF could be left trailing by a Swedish lorry with a bunk in the back and energy to spare. The other engines carried their own catches. The Rolls-Royce Eagle gave you the horsepower, but some operators grumbled about just how much fuel it drank to deliver it. The Cummins was strong and well-liked, yet choosing it meant stepping away from the trusty Gardner that had defined the British truck for a generation. None of these were fatal faults on their own, but put together they told a quiet story. The B Series was a brilliant answer to the question Britain had been asking back in the 1960s. The trouble was, the question itself was changing, and then the ground shifted under everyone's feet. For years, that 32-ton weight limit had quietly protected the British way of doing things. A simpler, lighter, less powerful truck made perfect sense for 32 tons. But in 1983, the limit was raised to 38 tons. More weight needed more power, and more power was exactly the ground on which the Europeans were strongest, and the old Gardner was weakest. The very thing that had made the British formula work was being taken away, almost overnight. It came at the worst possible time. A brutal recession had crashed down on the whole country. At the end of 1979, ERF had been building 16 trucks a day. At the bottom of the slump, it was building just 16 a week. The workforce at the Sandbach plant, once around 1,400 strong, was cut back to a little over 600, with the factory dropping to a 2-day week just to survive. Orders dried up everywhere. In 1981, ERF's sales in its own home market came to barely 1,000 trucks for the entire year. This was never the story of one bad lorry. It was the story of an entire industry being squeezed from every direction at once. The very last lorries to wear an ERF badge were really rebadged MAN trucks, built abroad, and in 2007 the famous name was quietly retired altogether. The independent maker from Sandbach was gone. It is tempting to call that an ending. It is fairer to call it a fight that lasted far longer than anyone had a right to expect. Today, a well-restored B Series still draws a crowd at any classic lorry show, parked proudly alongside the very Volvos and Scanias it once fought tooth and nail. The drivers who ran them remember the steady beat of the Gardner, The smell of that brown and tan cab on a frosty morning, and the simple satisfaction of a lorry that asked little and gave plenty. It was never the most powerful truck on the motorway, and it was never the most comfortable. It was something rarer than that. It was the last serious stand of an independent British lorry maker that simply would not give in.